Rain had a way of settling into the Olympic Peninsula that people who had never lived there mistook for gloom. It was not gloom, it was patience. The clouds sat low over the fir ridges above Quileute Creek most mornings, and the moss on the fence posts stayed the color of old bottle glass from October clear through May, and the air smelled the way it always smelled in that part of Washington state, of wet bark and diesel and the cold mineral breath of the Sound 11 miles west. It was the kind of place that made things slowly. Nobody in that country expected anything to happen fast, and for the most part, nothing ever did. The old-timers said the fog didn't lift so much as it simply grew tired of staying, and there was a kind of wisdom in that. The way there was wisdom in most things people around Forks said without meaning to sound wise at all. Owen Castellon was 15 years old, and he had lived his entire life inside that patience without ever once finding it boring. He was a narrow boy, not quite 5'8", with the kind of build that came from carrying things rather than lifting weights. His hair was a dull brown that never quite dried in that climate, and he wore it under a canvas cap gone soft and shapeless from years of rain, the brim stained dark along the edge where his fingers gripped it out of habit. His eyes were pale gray, almost the color of the Sound on an overcast afternoon, and they had the particular habit of sliding past people's faces to whatever object was nearby. A fence rail, a knot in a table, the grain running through a discarded plank. He could look at a piece of wood the way other boys his age looked at a phone screen, absorbed completely, indifferent to time. His hands told a different story than his quiet face. They were already scarred in small places, nicked along the knuckles, calloused hard at the base of each finger from a carving knife he had been given by his grandfather before the old man passed 3 winters back. He had not always been this quiet. 3 years earlier, when Owen was 12, his mother, Diane, had died after a short illness that the family did not discuss much, not because it was a secret, but because there was nothing left to say about it that hadn't already been said in the first exhausting months. She had been a school teacher at the elementary in town, the kind of woman who remembered every child's birthday and kept a drawer of spare mittens for the ones who forgot theirs. And when she was gone, the house had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with noise. Since then, Owen had turned inward in the particular way that some children do, not sullen, not broken, just careful, as though he had decided somewhere in the back of his mind that the world asked fewer painful questions of a boy who kept his hands busy. He had found that wood did not ask him anything he could not answer, and so he had gone looking for more of it. He lived with his father, Walter Castellon, in a low gray house at the end of a gravel spur road outside the town of Forks. Walter was 45, broad through the shoulders, with hands permanently stained along the knuckle creases from 20 years spent as a diesel mechanic servicing logging trucks up and down Highway 101. He did not speak often about his wife, and he did not speak often about much of anything, but he showed up. He fixed the hinge on Owen's toolbox without being asked. He left woodworking magazines folded open to certain pages on the kitchen table, saying nothing about why they were there. He made breakfast every morning before the 6 a.m. shift whistle blew at the mill, whether Owen was awake to eat it or not. And some mornings, Owen would come downstairs to find a plate covered with a dish towel and a note that said nothing more than "eat something" in his father's blunt handwriting. Behind their house stood an old boathouse that had not seen a boat in over a decade, its cedar shingles silvered by rain, one corner sagging where the sill had rotted through. A previous owner of the property had kept a small dinghy in it for salmon fishing on the Sound, but the dinghy had been sold off years before Owen was born, and the building had simply sat empty since, gathering spiderwebs and the smell of old creosote. Most people who saw it assumed it was waiting for someone to finally tear it down. Owen saw it as something else entirely. Every Thursday morning, a flatbed truck came grinding down the gravel spur belonging to Cascade Fir and Lumber and Millworks, the processing operation 2 miles toward town that cut Douglas fir and western red cedar into dimensional lumber and cedar shingles for half the county. Not every log that came off the trucks going into that mill met commercial grade. Twisted cedar rounds with too much taper to run straight through a saw, fir sections with heart rot nobody wanted to plane around, burl growths too knotted and unpredictable for a blade to cut clean, the kind of wood that dulled saw teeth and produced warped, unsellable lumber. Rather than pay the tipping fee at the county waste transfer station in Port Angeles, the mill had struck an old arrangement with Walter, a small favor between men who'd known each other since high school, to leave the rejects on the unused back corner of the Castellon property, free of charge, so long as Walter kept it from becoming a fire hazard. The driver was a heavy, stout man named Grady Pruitt, no relation to any family in this story you may have heard before. 61 years old, with a laugh that came easy and a peninsula drawl that turned every sentence into something unhurried, the kind of voice that made even bad weather reports sound like good news. Grady had been hauling for the mill for over 2 decades and long since stopped wondering what happened to the reject piles once he dropped them off. To him, the misshapen blocks sliding off his trailer were simply Thursday's leftovers, nothing more interesting than what got swept off the mill floor at the end of a shift. Most of the neighbors along the spur road found the whole thing mildly ridiculous. Nobody confronted the Castellans directly. It simply became one of those things people mentioned to each other in passing, the way small towns keep a running commentary on everybody's business without ever quite saying it to their face. At the feed store in town, at the counter of the one diner that stayed open past 7, in the gravel lot outside the Grange Hall on bingo nights, the growing pile behind Walter Castellan's boathouse came up enough that it had become a kind of local punchline, gentle in the way small-town jokes usually are, but a punchline all the same. "Walter's building himself a woodpile the size of a barn," a rancher named Del Whitmore said to another man at the feed store counter, loud enough that it made its way back around eventually. "Boys out there every afternoon playing in scrap nobody wanted. I hauled off worse than that to the burn pile years ago. Free firewood for the next 100 winters," the man beside him laughed, and Del laughed too, and neither of them meant much harm by it, the way men in that country rarely meant much harm by anything they said over a coffee counter. Nobody said any of this to Owen directly. He heard it anyway, the way kids in small towns always hear things eventually, second-hand, softened at the edges, but unmistakable in its meaning, carried home by a classmate's father who had been at the feed store, or overheard at the gas station while his own father filled the truck. He never answered it. He never brought it up at the dinner table or complained to his father about it. He simply waited until the truck disappeared back down the spur road each Thursday, then walked out to the new pile, put his palm flat against the bark of whatever had landed there, and began looking, the way the country itself seemed to move. He had been carving since he was 8 years old, starting with a folding knife his grandfather left him and a pile of driftwood picked up along the Sound on the long gray afternoons his mother used to take him beachcombing before she got sick. Birds first. Small, crude things, wrens and gulls with the proportions all wrong, wings too short or heads too large. The kind of mistakes that make a grandmother smile indulgently and put the thing on the mantel anyway. Then owls, which took him nearly 2 years to get the head shape right on, because owls, it turned out, were mostly about the eyes, and eyes were the hardest thing in the world to carve convincingly out of a material that had no eyes of its own to reference. Then, slowly, animals with more weight to them. A black bear reared up on its hind legs, the first piece that took him more than a week. A bull elk with antlers so thin they had snapped off twice before he learned to leave more wood at the base for support, a lesson that cost him 2 ruined blocks and a bruised thumb before it finally landed. Every one of his early failures went up on a shelf in his room rather than into the wood stove, because he wanted to remember exactly what had gone wrong and why. His father had asked him once why he kept the broken ones instead of burning them for kindling like anybody sensible would. "Because the next one won't make the same mistake," Owen had said, and Walter had nodded slowly and never brought it up again, though Owen noticed his father sometimes picked up the broken pieces on quiet evenings and turned them over in his hands before setting them back exactly where they'd been. His bedroom, by the time he was 15, no longer had space for anything that wasn't carved. Owls perched along the windowsill, feathers etched in overlapping rows that had taken entire winters to perfect. A pair of ravens faced each other on his dresser, wings half spread, feathers individually cut with a technique that had taken him the better part of a year to learn without splitting the grain along the quill lines. On his desk sat the piece he was proudest of at the time, a Roosevelt elk stag mid-bugle, head thrown back, antlers sweeping wide, done from a single fir block that Grady had dropped off 18 months before and that Owen had spent 4 months completing, working only on weekends because the school week left him too tired to trust his hands with anything delicate on weeknights. Still, Owen wanted more than animals rendered accurately. He had begun sketching things that did not exist in any field guide. Figures built from the old logging camp stories his grandfather used to tell him on winter evenings before the fire. Half-remembered peninsula folklore about the things that lived deep in the old-growth stands where the fog never fully lifted and the light never quite reached the forest floor. A heron with wingspan too wide to be real, wood grain running through its feathers like something alive underneath the surface, watching from the shallows of a creek that existed only in his imagination. He knew, in the quiet way he knew most things, that this was a strange thing for a 15-year-old in a logging town to want. He suspected people would laugh if they understood how seriously he meant it, how many nights he lay awake sketching creatures that had never walked any forest in Washington state. Sometimes he laughed at himself too, alone in the boathouse, knife in hand, wondering exactly what he thought he was building toward, whether a boy carving reject lumber behind his father's house could ever amount to anything beyond a strange hobby that neighbors joked about at the feed store. Then Thursday would come again, and another truckload would thud down onto the pile, and something in him would go quiet and certain in a way that had nothing to do with what anyone else thought. One October afternoon, Owen stood for a long time in front of a cedar burl section nearly 3 feet across, its grain twisted into knots and whorls that most sawyers would have rejected on sight as unworkable, the kind of wood that jammed a planer blade and made mill workers curse under their breath. He ran his palm across the rough curve of it and felt something under the bark that made him stop entirely, his hand resting flat against the wood like a doctor might rest a hand against a chest to listen for a heartbeat. The knot pattern near the center curved outward in a shape that looked, if you tilted your head and let your eyes go soft, almost like folded wings pressed close against a body. He carried it into the boathouse that evening, set it under the single bare bulb hanging from the rafter, and closed the weathered door behind him. Outside, the rest of the pile waited in the gray fading light to anyone passing on the spur road. Inside, something had just quietly begun. The boathouse became, over the following months, the only place Owen Castellan wanted to be. Every afternoon after the bus dropped him at the end of the spur road, he did his homework in the kitchen table in under 40 minutes flat, algebra and history and the occasional English essay dispatched with the efficiency of a boy who had somewhere better to be and then disappeared out back until his father called him in for supper. He had begun organizing the reject pile by wood type without anyone teaching him to. Cedar under the boathouse's eave where the rain wouldn't reach it, fir on pallets Walter had scavenged from the mill's own scrapyard, the rare walnut or maple sections that occasionally came through set apart entirely on a shelf of their own, because Owen had noticed without being told that every species wanted something different from the blade. Cedar split along its grain almost too willingly, forgiving of a heavy hand but unforgiving of an unattentive one. He learned all of this the way he learned most things, by getting it wrong first and remembering why. One Saturday, Walter came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee, hot chocolate for Owen, black coffee for himself, a small ritual they'd kept since Owen was small, and found his son standing motionless in front of the burls section for what must have been 15 minutes, no tool in his hand, no movement at all beyond the slow rise and fall of his breathing in the cold air. "What are you doing?" Walter finally asked, not unkindly, setting the mug down on the workbench beside his son. "Listening to it," Owen said, without turning around, "figuring out what it already wants to be." Walter didn't understand the sentence. Not fully, not the way Owen meant it, but something in his chest eased anyway, watching his son stand in a cold boathouse, fully absorbed in something that wasn't grief, something that had color and purpose to it instead of the flat gray quiet that had settled over the boy for the better part of 2 years after Diane passed. He didn't say any of that out loud. He simply picked up his coffee, leaned against the doorframe, and stayed a while longer than he needed to, watching his son work. The burl became a heron. It took him 11 weeks and 3 serious mistakes, each one costing him days of work, and on one occasion nearly the entire piece. The first time, he tried to carve the neck too thin for the grain direction, and it split clean through 2 days before he meant to finish it, the crack running diagonal across the throat in a way that made his stomach drop when he heard the wood give. He set the ruined piece down on the bench and sat with it for a long time before he noticed, once the anger had passed, that the split looked oddly like a fold in real feathers, the kind of natural crease a bird's neck makes when it turns to preen. He didn't discard the piece. He reworked the throat around the break instead of against it, following the accidental line rather than fighting it, and the finished bird ended up with a slight twist in its neck that made it look mid-turn, alert, alive in a way his earlier and more correct attempts had never quite managed. That mistake changed the way he worked from then on. He stopped fighting the wood's flaws and started asking what they were offering him instead. A knot became an eye, a crack became a fold of skin or fabric, a patch of unusual color where the grain had reacted to old insect damage became a shadow across a wing or a haunch, something he learned to plan his compositions around rather than around despite. By the following spring, the shelf inside the boathouse held a dozen finished pieces standing shoulder to shoulder in the gray window light. The heron with its twisted neck, the pair of ravens, the bugling elk, a black bear with claws splayed mid-stride across a fur base, and the first of his invented mythic figures, a stag-antlered forest guardian carved from a cedar round with the bark left natural along one flank, as though the animal were half emerging from the tree itself, caught in the act of stepping out of the wood that had made it. It was that piece a stranger first noticed. A man named Nathaniel Voss pulled his truck onto the Castellon property one gray Tuesday, having arranged through the mill to buy off a stack of reclaimed cedar rounds for restoration work he was doing down toward Port Angeles. Voss was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the unhurried manner of a man who had spent 30 years restoring historic buildings up and down the coast and had long since learned not to rush his judgment of craftsmanship, whether he was looking at a hand-hewn beam from 1890 or a teenager's woodshed. He wasn't looking for Owen, he was looking at lumber, walking the reject pile with a practiced eye, setting aside 3 cedar rounds that suited his purposes. But the boathouse door stood half open on his way back to the truck, and inside he caught sight of the forest guardian standing in the window light, and he stopped walking entirely, one hand still resting on the cedar round he'd been carrying. He found Owen at the workbench, already halfway back to sanding a raven's wing feather by feather, entirely unaware he had an audience. "Did you carve all of this?" Voss asked from the doorway. Owen looked up, startled, then looked down not right away after that first glance, uncertain what to say to a grown man he'd never met standing in his workshop. Voss set the cedar round down carefully outside the door and walked closer to the guardian, studying the transition where bark met grain carve, running his fingers an inch above the surface without touching it, the way people do with something they suspect might be fragile in a way that has nothing to do with wood strength. "You've barely scratched what you're capable of," Voss said finally, straightening up. Owen looked around the boathouse at the shelves of animals built from wood everyone else had thrown away and understood for the first time that someone outside his own family had looked at it and seen exactly what he saw. It was a strange feeling being seen like that by a stranger, and he didn't entirely know what to do with it beyond a quiet nod and a mumbled thanks. Voss returned 3 weeks later with a small enclosed trailer instead of his truck, saying he'd come back for more cedar, but spending nearly an hour walking the length of the shelves instead, asking Owen questions that were harder than compliments. Why this grain direction and not another? Why leave the bark here and not there? Why the twist in the heron's neck instead of correcting it back to something more anatomically proper? Owen found himself answering more fully than he expected to, drawn out by the seriousness of the questions, by the sense that this man actually wanted the real answer, not a polite one. When Voss finished, he folded his arms and looked at Owen directly. "People need to see this," he said. Owen looked doubtful. "They're not finished, not really. I still mess up the wing joints half the time." "They never will be if you're waiting for finished. Nothing worth looking at ever finishes. It just gets far enough along that it's ready to be seen." A week later, at Voss's urging and after a long conversation at the kitchen table that Walter mostly listened to rather than led, father and son loaded 3 folding tables worth of carvings into the truck bed and drove out to the Olympic Peninsula Craft and Timber Fair, held every October in Port Angeles, a 2-day event that drew woodworkers, blacksmiths, painters, and furniture builders from as far as Tacoma and the San Juans. Owen felt entirely out of place from the moment they set up.
His small table sat wedged between an established chainsaw carving artisan selling 6-foot bears for 4 figures apiece, his booth flanked by a running generator and a small crowd that gathered whenever he fired up his saw for a demonstration, and a woman with a booth of hand-turned wooden bowls polished to a glass finish, each one priced with a confidence Owen couldn't imagine attaching to anything he'd made. His own display, by comparison, looked modest almost to the point of apology. A dozen animals arranged on a folding table with a hand-lettered cardboard sign that simply read, Castellon Woodworks, Forks, W.A. No prices listed because he hadn't known what to charge, and his father hadn't either. People walked the aisle in 2s and 3s throughout the morning, glancing at his animals, occasionally smiling, mostly moving on towards booths that looked more finished, more expensive, more like what a craft fair was supposed to sell. A few children stopped, drawn by the raven's spread wings or the elk's antlers, only to be pulled gently along by parents already halfway to the next booth. One older woman picked up the heron, turned it over twice, asked if it came in a smallish size for a shelf, and set it back down when Owen said this was the only one. By early afternoon, the crowd had thickened considerably with the lunch rush, and still nothing had sold. Owen watched the chainsaw carver 2 booths down sell his 3rd bear of the day, and tried not to let it settle into his chest as anything more than simple fact. By 4 in the afternoon, he had sold nothing at all. The light outside had gone the color of wet slate, the way it did most autumn afternoons on the peninsula, and the crowd was beginning to thin as vendors around him started breaking down early. Owen began quietly repacking the pieces into their crates, wrapping each one in the same folded moving blankets they'd used to bring them, trying not to let his father notice the disappointment settling into his shoulders. Walter placed a hand on his son's shoulder, steady and warm even through the flannel. "One slow day doesn't decide your future," he said. Owen nodded, wanting to believe it, though the wanting felt thin against the long, quiet drive home he was already dreading.
As they prepared to load the last table into the truck bed, one final visitor approached the display, moving with the unhurried curiosity of someone who wasn't in any rush to be anywhere else. Her name was Maya Lindquist, 29 years old, a documentary filmmaker originally from Seattle, who had spent the last several years building a modest but devoted online following, making short films about overlooked craftspeople scattered along the Washington and Oregon coastline. Boat builders in Westport, a blacksmith in Astoria, an old woman in La Push who still wove cedar bark baskets the traditional way. Maya had auburn hair cut short at the jaw and a habit of watching people work rather than asking them questions right away, a habit that had served her well in a career built on patience and quiet observation rather than flash. She didn't ask the price of anything. She picked up the heron, turned it slowly in the fading light, studying the twist in its neck for longer than seemed necessary, and then asked what he was working on now. Owen hesitated, glancing at his father before opening the last crate. Inside sat an unfinished piece, a great gray owl mid-flight, wings half spread, talons extended, cut from a single cedar round with the feather detail only about 1/3 complete along the left wing, the right wing still mostly rough-shaped, waiting. Maya's eyes stayed on it a long moment. "Would you mind if I filmed you working on this?" she asked. "Not an interview, just working. However long it takes you, however boring it looks from the outside." Owen looked toward Walter. His father gave a quiet nod, the kind that carried more trust in it than either of them said out loud. Maya came out to the boathouse the following weekend, driving the 90 minutes from Port Angeles in a small hatchback loaded with a single camera and a folding tripod, nothing more elaborate than that. She set the camera on the tripod in the corner of the boathouse, angled to catch the workbench without getting in Owen's way, and simply let it run for nearly 3 hours while Owen carved feather after feather along the owl's outstretched wing, sharpening his chisels twice on the wheatstone his grandfather had left him, brushing curls of cedar off the bench without looking up, entirely lost in the work the way he always was when the door was closed and the light was right. Neither of them spoke very much. Maya asked 1 or 2 quiet questions early on. How long had he been doing this? Did he always work alone? And then largely let the silence hold, understanding instinctively that the silence was part of what she'd come to capture. The camera caught something unexpected. Not just a sculpture taking shape, it caught complete concentration, unbroken and unself-conscious, the particular stillness of someone who has forgotten there's anyone watching at all. Every careful cut reflected years of invisible practice hidden behind those weathered boathouse doors. 3 years of Thursday truckloads and quiet October afternoons that nobody outside the family had ever witnessed until now. Before leaving, Maya thanked Owen for letting her film. "I don't know how many people will watch this," she admitted honestly, packing her tripod back into its case, "but I think they should." Several days later, she uploaded a short film titled "The Boy Turning Rejected Cedar into Something the Mill Threw Away." Owen barely thought about it again in the days that followed. He went back to school, finished his homework in his usual 40 minutes, walked out to the boathouse each afternoon, kept carving, the owl's second wing slowly taking shape feather by feather just as the first had. Then Walter's phone started ringing. Voss called first, then someone from the mill office, then, within a matter of days, strangers whose numbers neither of them recognized. Maya's film had spread far beyond the peninsula, shared across social platforms, not because people were simply watching someone carve wood, but because they were watching an entire discarded pile of lumber quietly, patiently become something nobody had given it permission to become. Comments poured in from every corner of the country. People wanted to know if the owl was for sale, whether Owen took custom orders, whether he'd consider a full wingspan piece for a lobby or a lodge. A woodworking teacher in Ohio wrote to say she'd shown the film to her whole class. A man in Michigan said it was the first thing that had made him want to pick up a chisel in 20 years. Owen stood quietly inside the boathouse one evening, reading the messages on his father's phone, the light outside already the deep blue of a peninsula winter dusk. For the first time in his life, the dream that had existed only inside that old wooden building had stepped into the outside world, and he wasn't entirely sure yet what to do with the feeling that came with it, something between pride and a kind of nervous vertigo. The old boathouse no longer echoed with silence. Instead, every morning began with the steady rhythm of carving chisels, the hum of sanding tools, and the rich scent of cedar and fir dust drifting through the propped-open doors even on cold mornings. What had once been an abandoned building, sagging at one corner and forgotten by everyone but Owen, had quietly become the heart of something growing faster than he had ever imagined it could. The messages kept coming through that winter, and Walter took to reading them aloud at the kitchen table some evenings, partly to keep track of them, and partly, Owen suspected, because his father simply liked hearing them. Some people wanted to know if Owen accepted commissions. Others wrote simply to encourage the young artist, telling him they had never seen wooden animals with that much personality and quiet movement in them, that the pieces looked less carved than coaxed out of the wood. Owen read every message his father showed him. He answered very few, preferring, as always, to answer through the work itself. One evening, Walter set a spiral notebook on the workbench, its cover already a little battered from riding around in the truck cab. "You can't remember every order in your head anymore," he said simply. He opened it. There were already 2 full pages filled with requests in his father's blunt handwriting, a heron for someone's 40th anniversary, 3 separate requests for a forest guardian like the one Voss had first noticed, a collector from Portland asking if Owen could manage a full life-sized owl for an entryway, wingspan and all. Owen stared quietly at the growing list, the pencil marks crowding the page in his father's careful block letters. For the first time, his biggest challenge was no longer learning how to carve something well. It was learning how to manage time, how to say no to some requests so that the ones he said yes to could be done right. The following weekend, father and son stood inside the aging boathouse, studying its cracked walls and sagging corner in the gray morning light. Walter crossed his arms, considering it the way he considered an engine that needed more than a patch job. "If we're going to do this," he said, "we do it right." For nearly 2 months that winter, every free afternoon and most weekends were spent rebuilding rather than carving. They reinforced the warped floor with heavy fir beams salvaged fittingly from the mill's own reject pile.
They replaced the single small window that had leaked cold air every winter with two larger ones that let in proper daylight, and installed real overhead lighting to replace the bare bulb Owen had been working under for years, and built long drying racks along the back wall where reclaimed hardwood could season properly before it ever met a blade, exactly the way Owen had already been doing it by instinct, just with more room to do it well. Nothing inside the workshop looked expensive when they finished. Everything about it looked deliberate, purpose-built by two people who understood exactly what it needed to be.
Owen insisted on keeping the original workbench, scarred along one edge and stained dark with years of cedar oil where he'd carved his first crooked wren at 8 years old. "It reminds me where I started," he told his father, and Walter didn't argue, only nodded and left it exactly where it stood. When the renovations were finally finished, Walter carved a simple sign from a leftover cedar plank, Castellan Woodworks, using a router he'd borrowed from a friend at the mill, and hung it above the boathouse entrance himself on a gray Sunday afternoon. Neither of them said much afterward. They simply stood outside looking at it until the last of the daylight went out of the sky, the porch light from the main house casting a thin yellow glow across the gravel between them. Soon, Owen realized that random custom orders taken one at a time made it difficult to improve his techniques consistently, each new piece pulling him in a different direction before he'd fully mastered the last one. Instead of accepting every request individually as it came in, he decided, with Walter's help sorting the growing notebook of requests, to organize his work into carefully planned collections. The heron collection came first, focused on movement and the particular tension of a bird caught mid-turn or mid-flight. The guardian collection followed, his invented mythic figures drawn from his grandfather's old logging camp stories, each one built entirely around whatever grain pattern the reclaimed cedar happened to offer, so that no two guardians were ever quite alike. The elk collection explored antler structure and the challenge of carving thin, load-bearing forms without snapping them, a lesson learned expensively in his early attempts. And eventually, the owl collection, born directly from the piece Maya had filmed, became by far his most requested work, people drawn again and again to the particular stillness and alertness he managed to carve into a creature that, in real life, was mostly known for silence. Cascade fir lumber changed too, without anyone at the Castellan house asking them to. Employees who had once joked about the Castellan woodpile while unloading their Thursday deliveries began setting aside especially unusual hardwood pieces rather than mixing them into the general reject stack, calling the house directly whenever an oddly figured burl or a heavily knotted cedar round came off the line. Grady Pruitt took to searching the yard himself some mornings before his route, looking for the kind of grain pattern he'd learned over the past year that Owen would recognize possibilities in ways he never would have himself. One afternoon, a woman named Renata Cole arrived unannounced, an interior designer from Portland who specialized in high-end mountain and coastal homes and had seen Maya's films shared twice in the same week by two different clients. She spent nearly an hour walking the shelves without interrupting Owen's work, watching him from a respectful distance, the way Voss had taught him, without realizing it, most first-time visitors eventually learned to do. "You don't carve the wood," she said finally when Owen looked up from his bench. "You just let it finish becoming what it already was." She commissioned 4 pieces for a lodge project outside Leavenworth, on the east side of the mountains, on the single condition that Owen work exactly as he always did, at his own pace, in his own order. "No shortcuts," she said before she left. "I'd rather wait a year for the right piece than get 4 wrong ones by spring." Among the visitors who came that following spring, once the film had settled into its slower, steadier life of being shared quietly rather than going through its first loud burst of attention, was Harlan Pierce, 74 years old, a retired logger who had spent 40 years working timber up and down the peninsula before an early mill closure had ended his career sooner than he'd planned and left him quietly bitter about most talk of dreams and opportunity, the kind of talk he associated with people who'd never had to meet a payroll or watch an industry shrink out from under them. Harlan had been one of the men at the feed store years before, laughing along with Del Whitmore about Walter's growing woodpile, though he'd never given it much more thought than that at the time. He walked the length of the workshop slowly, his cane tapping softly against the new floorboards, stopping in front of the great gray owl, now finished, wings fully spread, every feather individually cut and catching the afternoon light differently depending on where a person stood to look at it. He was quiet for a long moment, longer than seemed natural, and Owen, watching from the bench, wondered if he'd said something wrong or if the old man simply didn't care for the piece. Then, Harlan took his cap off, an old habit from a different era, the kind of gesture men his age still made without quite realizing they were making it. "I owe you an apology, son," he said. Owen looked at him, genuinely confused. "For what?" "I looked at that pile behind your house for 3 years, he said, nodding toward the window and the drying racks visible beyond it. "Standing at that feed store counter, laughing along with the rest of them. All I ever saw was scraps somebody should have hauled to the burn pile." He glanced back at the owl, at the particular way its head was turned, alert to something just out of frame. "You saw something else the whole time, and none of us bothered to ask what." "It's the same wood," Owen said quietly, not quite sure what else to offer. "I know," Harlan said, turning his cap over once in his hands before setting it back on his head. "That's what gets me. You didn't change the wood at all. You changed how the rest of us look at it. That's a harder thing to do than carving, if you want my opinion. I spent 40 years around timber and never once thought to do that." Late that same afternoon, after Harlan had gone, another Cascade fir truck grinding down the gravel spur, same as it had every Thursday going on 4 years running, Grady Pruitt climbed down from the cab, calling out before his boots even hit the gravel that he'd found something unusual in the mill yard that morning, a cedar burl bigger than anything he'd hauled out to the property before, one that the sire had taken one look at and set aside without even trying to run it through a blade. Owen walked over, placed his palm flat against the rough bark before it had even finished sliding off the flatbed, and stood there a moment with his eyes closed, the way he still did with every new piece, no matter how many hundreds had passed through his hands by then, feeling for whatever was waiting under the surface before he let himself start guessing at it out loud. Somewhere under that weathered bark, something else was already waiting to be found. It always was if a person was willing to stand still long enough to notice. People eventually came to believe that Owen Castellon had become known because he could carve better than anyone twice his age, and there was some truth in that. 4 years of quiet, unglamorous practice having done exactly what 4 years of practice does to a steady hand. But Owen understood it a little differently. In the quiet way he understood most things. The gift had never really been in his hands alone. It had been in his willingness to look at something everyone else had already decided was worthless. A bent log, a knotted burl, a pile of rejects nobody wanted to pay to haul away. And wait, patiently, without needing anyone else's permission, for it to show him otherwise. Maybe there's something in your own life today that feels used up, or overlooked, or past the point of being worth the effort. A relationship you've written off, a skill you set aside years ago because nobody seemed to notice it, a version of yourself you assumed had already been decided, the way the feed store counter decided without much thought that a pile of reject lumber was only ever going to be firewood. Before you let it go, it might be worth asking, the way Owen asked every log before he ever picked up a blade, what it's still capable of becoming, given enough patience and the willingness to keep showing up for it, one ordinary rainy afternoon at a time, long before anyone else is watching or has any reason to believe it will amount to anything at all.